The Canon R6 Mark II is a great camera. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and it's Morbin time. So for disclosure, Canon did not sponsor this video. In fact, they didn't even send me this camera. Instead, I borrowed it and this lens from Camera Canada. So big shout out to them. They're a great store for camera gear, and they always help this channel out when called upon. It's not perfect, of course. It still has some classic Canon annoyances, like how your histogram and level turn off when you start recording, the custom white balance tool that's straight out of 2002, where you have to take a photo to set a custom white balance in video. I'm also still annoyed that the camera turns off when you open the car door, so hot swapping is impossible. And I think they might be the only camera brand that's still putting micro HDMI ports in their full-size bodies, which is atrocious. But if you can move past those annoyances, you're left with a terrific camera for both photo and video. But let's focus more on the video side today. Regarding build and ergonomics, it's pretty standard for Canon, which is good. I find it intuitive and easy to use. I like that there's a dedicated photo-video toggle that's not tangled up with the power switch. Although, is it just me, or does Canon seem to have a new power switch design on every camera they've made recently? This one is fine, it just took some getting used to. The hand feel is good, the menus are familiar, and the touch screen is fantastic. There are a couple of new additions to that menu though. This camera now has focus breathing correction, although it's only available for a couple of lenses at the time of recording this video. I also noticed the anti-flicker shooting option is now available for video and not just photo, which I don't think was the case on the original R6. It works well by letting you set a custom shutter speed with more granularity to combat flickering lights, and it even has an automatic detection method. Nice inclusion. There's also some changes regarding overheating. This camera does not have the high temperature setting we saw in the R3, so you're stuck with whatever threshold this camera is set to natively. But they did add this new temperature display that has several bars that increase as the camera gets hotter, definitely more informative and useful than the previous system. Now, when it comes to overheating, I had no issues at all with the 4K 24 or 4K 30. I was able to record for 2 hours and 16 minutes before the battery died, and that was just one long continuous clip, as the R6 Mark II has no 30-minute limit, which is great. And during that time, the temperature gauge didn't even show up. However, when recording in 4K 60, I only got 42 minutes before the camera overheated, but this is actually in line with Canon's marketing. They claimed it would get 40 minutes, and I was able to, so no harm done. And I think 40 minutes continuous is probably more than enough for most people's 4K 60 needs. And if you're just recording shorter clips with pauses in between, the camera didn't overheat for me at all. And even if you overheat it at 4K 60, the 4K 24 is still usable, and the camera actually cools down when in this mode. 4K 60 is much harder on the battery though. One of those 40-minute runs will use up about half of your battery, so expect under 90 minutes runtime total in that mode. And as far as cooldown, I let it sit for 3 minutes after the 40-minute 4K 60 clip, and at which point I was able to record for another 15 minutes before it overheated again. And then for extending your battery life, you do have a USB-C port for power delivery, which works well to vastly expand your runtime. You can also use this for charging, but I found it rather slow compared to some other brands that I've tested. Now when it comes to recording modes, this camera is more stripped down than some other models in Canon's lineup. There's no internal RAW recording and no all-intra modes either. You just have IPB recording, but only in 16:9, so there's no DCI recording or true 24p frame rates. Max frame rate for 4K is 60 frames per second, and it's 180 FPS in 1080p. However, that 60 FPS is impressive. First off, it's completely oversampled from the 6K sensor, just like the 24 and 30p, but there's no added crop. So your framing and detail is identical, whether you shoot in 24 or 60. I love this. This is fantastic. And because there's extra resolution to work with, you can switch into an APS-C mode as well, which is nice to have. However, the best part of all of this is that the rolling shutter is quite good considering the oversampling and uncropped 4K. In full frame, I measured the rolling shutter at 15.9 milliseconds, which is great considering what we're getting. For comparison, that's nearly twice as fast as the original R6, much faster than the Sony a7 IV, which comes in at around 26 milliseconds, and about on par with the R5. So this is a great result. In an APS-C mode, it's even faster, of course, measuring in at 9.9 milliseconds. Now, there are some quirks you should be aware of regarding actually recording these files. First, while you can record externally over HDMI with a proper 4K clean feed, you can't record internally and externally at the same time. If you disconnect the HDMI, you can do backup recording internally to the 2 SD cards if you wish, which is appreciated. But just like on previous Canon cameras, the auto switch function for relay recording is bad. So if you're trying to double your capacity with 2 cards, you should know that when one card fills up, it doesn't keep recording automatically to the other card. All it does is queue up the second card, but you have to press the record button again to have it resume. And like I said, you can't swap out fresh cards either without the camera turning off as soon as you open the card door. Also, the camera does output 10-bit, but only when using Canon Log 3. The rest of the picture profiles are all 8-bit. C-Log 3 is also the gamma with the most dynamic range on this camera, but I definitely wanted to measure it because it was quite lackluster on the original R6, to be honest. So I busted out the Xyloid 21, and according to Imatest, a total of 12.2 stops were detected. That's the number here next to slope-based DR. And then if we account for noise, we get a score of 11.1. That's with a signal-to-noise ratio of 2, meaning good, clean stops. So while this is an improvement of about half a stop over the original R6, it's still not an impressive result. For comparison, the A7 IV scores a 12.8 in the medium category with a total of 14.7 stops detected. This was with the noise reduction option on the R6 Mark II turned off, by the way. You might be able to get a slightly higher medium score by enabling that noise reduction, but it'll never exceed 12.2. I think what we're seeing here is a limitation in conversion bit depth from Canon, and maybe the implementation of Canon Log 3. I believe Canon only uses a 12-bit process in these cameras instead of a 14 or 16-bit conversion into a more preferred Canon Log 2. I believe that's the bottleneck. And because there's no internal RAW, you can't change gammas in post. But even if you could, again, that bit depth would likely be a limitation. That's why I don't imagine you'll see a huge improvement using the ProRes RAW on this camera, which is available via HDMI, but I believe that's spec'd at only 10-bit in full frame and 12-bit in APS-C. And this could even account for the improvement in read speed. The Fuji cameras, for example, read much faster in 12-bit mode than they do in 14-bit, but sacrifice dynamic range. So I think this illustrates the biggest difference in concept between this camera and the Sony a7 IV. But if we look at the graph here, it looks like the shadows are just chopped off below a certain point. This is corroborated by the low 1.0 score matching the total stops of 12.2. Usually we like to see a patch range that's higher than the 1.0 score, indicating that there's still some noisy stops in the shadows that can be recovered. But that isn't the case here. There's only the 12 stops regardless of what you do in the shadows. So how is that noise anyway? Well, it's decent. You can get great results up to ISO 12,800 and even a little over. But how you expose plays a big role here, which is another reason why I'm not a huge fan of Canon Log 3. If you plan to follow by-the-book exposure practices for C-Log 3, you have to expose middle grade down at around 32.8 IRE, I believe, which is much lower than in Canon Log 2. And if you have a moody, shadowy shot, this can result in pulling up a bunch of noise with the shadows. Not a big deal if you're shooting outside in bright sunlight, but if you plan on shooting moody interiors and want to use log, I recommend overexposing by at least a stop. Maybe even 2 stops if you want to turn the noise reduction off in the camera. Now, when it comes to dialing in that exposure, Canon gives you zebras, which is nice, but they've also added false color in this camera, which is an appreciated inclusion. Definitely makes exposing to a gray card very easy. Oh, also keep in mind that on this camera and a lot of other Canon cameras, that you'll get less noise if you stick to full stops of ISO instead of 1/3 increments. So ISO 1600 is cleaner than 1250, and ISO 3200 is cleaner than 2500, and so on. Color on this camera is terrific, and if you do use C-Log 3, set the color to Cinema Gamut, which will allow you to use Canon's official C-Log 3 Cinema Gamut to wide DR LUT, which is excellent. And actually, if you're using DaVinci Resolve, the color space transform for that combination works great too, and is even slightly more color accurate. Just doing a bit of an audio test here. I've got a Rode VideoMic NTG plugged in directly into the microphone port on the camera, mounted on top, and then I've got my headphones plugged in as well. And this is the distance that I'm talking to the microphone. And it sounds good. You can set the gain manually, so I have it set to the lowest +1, so we'll get sort of like the bass noise floor here in this configuration. I'll just be quiet for a second. And then there's options in there for auto gain and the wind filter if you want to use the built-in microphone. And then in a different section of the menu, there is the ability to increase the quality of the audio recording at an increased bit rate, I guess would be the cost. I don't know if they're switching over to LPCM or what they're doing, but yeah, this is what the audio sounds like recorded directly into the Canon R6 Mark II. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time discussing autofocus. We're at a point now where it either passes the reliability test or it doesn't. And when it comes to talking head shots like this, you can count on this camera to keep you or your subject in focus without anything weird going on. It has several different subject types it can track and even has an intelligent auto-switching function between them. And it also has refined controls for speed and sensitivity, so no complaints there. The only aspect of the autofocus I don't like on this camera is the touch tracking. It's not very sticky and it often doesn't do what I want it to do. So don't buy it solely for that purpose. Get a Sony instead if that's what you need. But if all you need to do is point it at a person and let it track their eye while they talk, this camera is mostly flawless in that use case. In fact, why don't I stick it on a tripod next to my main angle so we can see how it performs for the rest of this video tracking my face. All right, Lastly, stabilization is supposedly improved, but to be honest, I didn't really notice a big difference in video. It still does a great job of letting you hold static shots at longer focal lengths, but it also still suffers from some of that warpy stuff when walking around with wider lenses. Okay, let's wrap up. Canon did a fantastic job with this camera. For full-frame cameras in its price range, it's probably the most compelling option. The closest comparison would be the Sony a7 IV, and it's interesting to see how they trade blows. The Canon pulls out some big wins when it comes to rolling shutter and the uncropped 4K 60. But the Sony is better when it comes to dynamic range. Not having that 12-stop limit and being able to use their best log curve gives you more flexibility and latitude on the Sony than you're going to get on the R6 Mark II. But then again, if you're just using it in a studio setting like this, both provide adequate dynamic range and you probably won't notice a difference. There's obviously a bunch more minor differences between those two cameras, but I don't often like to compare cameras from different brands because most people aren't just switching systems willy-nilly, and when they do, it's usually about the lenses or some other investment and not the bodies. These days it feels like there's a new camera body every few months, but most people hold on to their lenses for years. And there's definitely a strong argument to be made in favor of Sony due to their continued support of third-party lenses, which sadly is not something we can say about Canon any longer. And in my opinion, that is a terrible anti-consumer decision that annoys me to no end. But if you're someone who only buys first-party lenses anyway, well, at least the majority of Canon's RF lenses are quite good. So I think what's more important here is that Canon now has a great answer to the a7 IV at that price point for users who are invested in their RF system. But if you truly have no allegiance either way and you just really need an answer between which of those two cameras to buy, get the Sony if you want to shoot on a tripod with more dynamic range and the ability to touch all the things you want to focus on. And get the Canon if you want to be able to do this at 60 frames per second. For most other use cases, get either one. It doesn't matter. It's great. They're both great. Everything's great. Yeah, all right. I'm done.